It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Bonnie Vega earned her undergraduate degree in history from Washington University and a master's in counseling psychology from St. Louis University. She taught global history at St. Louis University High School and American history at Evansville Day School. For the past 5 years, she has lectured on American history at Missouri History Museum. A few of the topics include a 5-part series on the Civil War, programs on George Washington, the history of St. Louis, the history of American slavery, Thomas Jefferson, Prohibition, Manifest Destiny, and Religion in America. She is currently doing a 30-part series called Great Moments in American History, which is the history of the United States from the first inhabitants of North America to the Civil Rights Movement. Bonnie has served as a volunteer at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum for nearly 5 years. Would you please join me in welcoming Bonnie Vega as she shares her presentation on Lincoln's Cabinet?
Right, that 30-part series at the museum has taken almost, I'll finish next spring, it will be almost 3 years that it took to do it. But those people have been coming for 3 years to that. So not all of them, but as many as they can make. So Jeremy asked me to talk on Lincoln's Cabinet last year. And at first I was a little hesitant because I thought, well, everybody's read about the cabinet during the war years, so I really didn't want to cover that again. So I thought, well, I'll talk about these men before they became part of Lincoln's cabinet, because we all bring our own baggage with us. We are all a product of our environment. So it was the time period that these men lived in, their experiences that they brought to the cabinet with them, and would of course color their decision making. So before I get into the individual men, I want to talk about this period called the antebellum age in American history. The first thing I think that is unique about these men is that they are first-generation Americans. Our first American-born president is Martin Van Buren. Every president before that was born a British colonial. So he was our first president who was born after 1783, after we declared our independence. That's true of all of these men too. So they are considered first-generation Americans. And that brings with it a tremendous level of responsibility. I think you see it in Lincoln's writings all the time. When he talks about, the Union has to be preserved, it's not going to fall apart on my watch. All of these men had a very deeply held belief in that they could not let this fail. Europeans called this time period in American history the Great Experiment, because they were just waiting for it to fail. They knew this could never succeed. After the Constitutional Convention, someone asked Washington, well, how long do you think the country will last? And he said, 20 years, and then it will fall apart. And that was 1808, when Congress would have to enact the prohibition against bringing Africans into the United States. That's in the Constitution in 1808. He said, as soon as that legislation is passed, that will be the end of the Union. Another one of the delegates at the convention said, this will end in a civil war. He said there is no way this union can be preserved. So even Americans had very little hope for this great experiment. So for these men, it was critical, not just for Lincoln, but that they not let this fail. So that was one thing that they had in common. The oldest of the cabinet members is Edward Bates, and he was born in 1793. That's just 4 years after the constitutional government began. So he was right there at the beginning of the nation, and grew up with all of those experiences. And the others followed soon behind. Seward was born in 1801, Wells was born in 1802, Chase in 8, Abraham Lincoln in 9. So they were all part of this very beginning of this experiment. So that was one thing that they brought with them. And that's why they were so determined to preserve the Union at all costs. Another thing that was going on during this time period in the antebellum age, in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. This was a period of tremendous religious revivalism in the United States. It actually is called the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening happened in the mid-1700s when a group of Congregationalist ministers denied the theory of predestination. So that was a major shift in American religion at that point. This time period in the antebellum age, called the Second Great Awakening, was really based on this philosophy of Christian perfectionism. You have to make yourself as perfect a Christian as you possibly can be, which led to major reforms in the country. The two major reform movements were temperance and anti-slavery during this time period. So these men grew up hearing all of these evangelical preachers who were traveling around the country, addressing huge crowds of people. One camp meeting was 10,000 people that attended. People would load up a wagon, go to this field, and be there for a week and hear preachers talking all day long about this idea. Even one of them who held camp meetings in the South would not give communion to slave owners because they could not be perfect Christians if they owned slaves. So slavery was a very integral part of this reform movement that was happening. It was also based on another principle called millennialism. Again, this is 1800 that this begins, and people held this firmly held belief that if they could become perfect Christians, Jesus would come to the United States. Not only would he come back to earth, but he would come to the United States. So it was your almost patriotic duty to perfect your heart. And that's one thing that this is based on. Lyman Beecher, who was the leading temperance evangelist during this time, used a word that they called suasion. I have to persuade you to stop drinking. There was never any idea of this being legislated. You're still not a perfect Christian if it's legislated. It has to come from your heart. You have to have a conversion experience and sign the teetotal agreement and say you're not going to drink anymore. That's where the word teetotaler comes from. If you signed the temperance contract, you gave up all alcohol. So that was the kind of tone of this movement. And the anti-slavery movement soon started to follow. You couldn't just be morally against slavery. You had to, if you were really going to be true, you had to become an abolitionist. That slavery had to end tomorrow, and in any way that could be done. So there were all levels in these movements, but some of them were much more radical than others. When Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, yes, it was a story of slavery, but the reason she wrote it was to persuade the hearts of slave owners. She was Lyman Beecher's daughter. So her idea was suasion. If I can persuade you to give up slavery, then you will go to heaven. If you don't, you're condemned to hell. So it really wasn't to be an anti-slavery tract, but more giving up your slaves. That was one of the reasons that she wrote the book. So, of course, Southerners became very defensive about all of this. They even call it the peculiar institution. In this land that's supposed to be based on freedom, they take away the freedom of 4 million people in the country. So they came up with this theory called the positive good, that this is a good thing. These slaves, we take care of them, we feed them, we clothe them. Sometimes we do have to apply a little discipline, and we beat them with a whip, and we cut their Achilles heel, and we brand them, and we cut their ears off. But that's okay. That's part of the positive good. So they had to come up with a defense for slavery. And most people in the North didn't know anything about slavery. I mean, you didn't go on vacation and visit a slave plantation. You know, there weren't any movies about it. You didn't see it on the news every night. So during this time period, also in the North begin to appear many escaped slaves. And they start talking about slavery, and they start writing their autobiographies. And of course, very famous people like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth go out on speaking tours for the Anti-Slavery League. So the eyes of Northerners are really opened to what slavery is. This would definitely have an impact on men like Stanton and Seward as they were growing up during this time period. Then there was a major shift in economics during this time period. The North and the South had always been two different economic systems from, Jamestown and Plymouth. They were very different economically. But those differences began to grow even more obvious during the early 1800s as the North began its infancy of industrialization. Cotton was king at this time. Cotton controlled the economy of this country. And so when Lincoln said in his second inaugural address that the Civil War was God's punishment on the United States for the sin of slavery, equally held by North and South. The North was just as guilty of maintaining slavery as the South was. Northern textile mills bought the cotton that they made clothes into, that they then sold back to the slaves. Northern ships carried slaves from Africa and transported them around the United States. So everyone was complicit in this great sin of slavery. It just wasn't people who owned slaves, but everyone. But during this time period, it was becoming more evident to Southerners that they may not be able to control the economy or the political agenda of the country much longer. And that was because the United States started gaining territory west of the Mississippi River. First the Louisiana Purchase, and then the California and New Mexico and Arizona as a result of the Mexican War. That's 2/3 of the land mass of the United States. What's going to happen in that territory? What if they all come in as free states? Then there will be more representatives in the House, more senators, more electoral votes to elect anti-slavery presidents. And the South would lose control of the political agenda in this country. Even during this time period, John Quincy Adams calls the United States a slaveocracy. We are controlled by the Southern slave owners. So the South knew that eventually they might lose control of the nation as a result, and then Congress might legislate the end of slavery. Lincoln actually said that he thought slavery would be ended by 1900. Now, I don't know how he came up with that particular year. Maybe it was just a millennial year, but he thought that it would just die a natural death by 1900. And that could happen as all these free states came in to the Union. The fourth thing that influenced these men in their lives is what political scientists call the second party system. Up to the time of Monroe, there was basically only one political party in the country, and that was the party of Thomas Jefferson. Actually, Monroe ran unopposed for the presidency. He was our only president who's never had an opposition candidate. That's how strongly we were literally a one-party nation. But then Andrew Jackson came along, and that shifted politics in this country. Now there were two parties to contend with very different political ideologies. So from 1820 on, when Missouri asked for admission to the Union, slavery would become the topic that would dominate the political agenda until the Civil War. So for 40 years, it was the topic that controlled all the decisions that were made. And even Thomas Jefferson, who was still alive in 1820, when he heard of the Missouri Compromise, called it a fire bell in the night. This was the bell that would ring in the Civil War. It took 40 years to get there, but he knew that's where we would eventually have to end up. So then sort of the final nail in the coffin was the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Law. So now everyone was a slave catcher in the country. And to anti-slavery people and abolitionists, this was an abomination, that they had to participate in capturing slaves or be fined and imprisoned if they didn't. So as a result of this whole debate over slavery, new political parties would form during this time period. And they were always in flux. There would be one that would live for one cycle and then die, and another one that would show up. And it would eventually end in the war in Kansas, which is really the beginning of the Civil War, when Kansas asked for admission as a slave state, and Congress votes down their constitution and says, go back and write another one. And finally, they are admitted in 1861 as a free state. But that led to an actual war in Kansas. So that's the kind of background that these men are living in before they become secretaries in the cabinet. And it would definitely affect their philosophy, their outlook on life, and therefore the decisions that they would make in Lincoln's cabinet. And they come from very different backgrounds, and they represent almost every element of the political spectrum in this country. Probably the most diverse cabinet any president has ever had. Other than maybe FDR's was not diverse politically, but they were diverse in what they brought to the table and allowed the country to get out of the Depression. So that would be the closest analogy probably to Lincoln's cabinet. So not in order of alphabetical order, but I think in order of importance. I think William Seward was the most important member of Lincoln's cabinet. He was born, like I said before, in 1801. He was born in upstate New York. Now, during this religious revival period, upstate New York was actually called the burned out district. And that doesn't mean they were having forest fires. It was called that because this is where everyone was burning with religious zeal. This was just the epicenter of revivalism in this country. So Seward experienced every major evangelist who came through the area and heard them speak. And it would definitely influence his attitudes in life. It's also where the ladies held the Seneca Falls Convention demanding their rights as citizens of the United States. His wife was an ardent abolitionist. So you can see the trajectory that his life is set on just from the very place that he was born in the United States. He was the third child in his family, and his father actually owned slaves. New York State abolished slavery when they wrote their Constitution at the end of the Revolutionary War, but it was the most gradual emancipation in the country. If you were a slave in 1783, you would be a slave until you died. If you were under the age of 21, you would be free when you turned 21. So slaves existed in New York until the 1820s as a result. But so it was the most gradual emancipation of any of the states. A state like Pennsylvania, it was automatic. It was where we allow slavery one day, the next day, done. But New York wasn't like that. So his father did own slaves. He went to college at the age of 15. Now you have to remember at this time period, college was what high school is to us. These were young boys, 15 and 16 years old, who went off to college. So he went to Union College in Schenectady, New York. He was an outstanding student. He was a member of Phi Beta Kappa. And you're going to hear that theme throughout all of the cabinet members. So you can see why their attitude toward Lincoln wasn't very positive, because they were all so highly educated, and he wasn't. But he did leave school before graduating because he took a teaching job in Georgia, of all places. A friend of his wanted to leave school also, and he already had a job in Georgia. So at this time, they called him Henry. His parents called him Henry, not William. So Henry went along with his buddy to Georgia and took a teaching job there. He was treated very hospitably on the plantation that he lived, but it was the first time he actually witnessed what slavery was like. So this was no longer just a word to him. He actually got to see it firsthand. So this is 1816, 17, in that time period that he is experiencing this. He graduated from college in 1820, and he began the study of law in Goshen, New York. He passed the bar exam in 1822, and he could have practiced in Goshen, but he disliked the town and sought a practice in Western New York. He joined the practice of a retired judge, Elijah Miller, whose daughter happened to be Frances Miller, a classmate of his sister's at Emma Willard's female seminary. Frances was one of the most educated women in the United States at this time, and so they married in 1824. That same year, he also met a man who would not control his political life, but direct his political life, and that was Thurlow Weed, who, when we say that name now, has a very negative connotation. He is the epitome of the political boss, reminiscent of Tammany Hall in New York City, equated with corruption in politics. But that was Seward's mentor, Thurlow Weed. And as a result of that, he got Seward involved in politics. He saw a young protege here that he could kind of mold and could achieve great things, not just becoming the governor of New York, but definitely the president of the United States. So the two men together thought very big. They weren't just thinking of local or state politics. Despite the benefits to Seward's career, again, he would always be tainted with that perception of corruption because of his association with Thurlow Weed. And many scholars believe it's the reason that he lost the presidential nomination in 1860, because of his association with this man. So almost from the time he settled in Auburn, New York, he got involved in politics. At that time, as I said, by that time period, there were new political parties emerging all the time. New York, at this point, was kind of controlled by Martin Van Buren, who would be Andrew Jackson's vice president and then become president himself. They controlled the state legislature in New York. They were actually called the Albany Regency because they controlled the state. And they basically governed whenever Van Buren was away. So Seward originally supported the Regency, but in 1824, it had been broken, and he concluded it was because of their corruption. So he joined the anti-Masonic Party that was very prevalent in upstate New York at this time, because they felt that the Masons were a cult. They were, now again, remember this religious fervor that's going on. This is a satanic cult. That's what they believed the Masons were. So it had to be rooted out if we were, again, going to achieve this level of Christian perfection. So it wasn't a very long-lived party, but he was the leading candidate in opposition to President John Quincy Adams in the first election between the two men. Now, they forgot to take into consideration that every president we'd have had been a Mason up to this point, including George Washington. But, because it was so secret, they didn't know what went on at those meetings, and that sounds a little cultish to them. So we might as well root this out. By 1830, he was nominated to become a state senator, and he was elected by just 2,000 votes at that time. So now he's moved into the state legislature. Jackson easily won the election of 1828, and so the people who followed him were this new party, the Democrats, and an opposition party grew up called the Whig Party. And Seward becomes a member of the Whig Party in opposition to the Democrats. The Whigs believed in legislative action to develop the country. They were very much concerned about developing the infrastructure, roads, bridges, to allow the economy of the country to grow, to allow people to move west. That wasn't the philosophy of the Jacksonian Democrats. They were mostly Southern slave owners, and they could care less about a road being built. As long as they could get the cotton to the levee and get it on a ship, what need did they have for roads? So they could care less. They wanted to make sure that their harbors were dredged, but that was the only infrastructure that they were concerned about. So many of the anti-Masons became Whigs at this point. So people are always changing political parties. Abraham Lincoln would do it. He was a Whig and he would become a Republican. So it was a time period in which political parties represented the philosophies of people. And if you didn't like one of the two, you started your own. Basically, that's what happened. So in 1834, Seward ran for governor of New York. He's only 38 years old at this point. And the election was basically on President Jackson's policies during this time period. They were very popular, and it was a strong year for Democrats, and Seward was defeated by 11,000 votes. And his state Senate term had expired, so Seward went home to continue his law practice. But again, Thurlow Weed wanted to get him involved, so in the 1838 election, he ran for governor of New York again. This time he was successful because now Martin Van Buren is president, and people aren't so crazy about what he's doing. So the Whigs were able to elect their candidate to be the governor of the state. This time he won by 10,000 votes in the state out of the 400,000 that were cast. In his annual message, in his first annual message to the state legislature, I think he very clearly states what his political philosophy and his trajectory for the country would be. He said, America's great unexploited resources have to be developed, and stated that immigration should be encouraged in order to take advantage of them. He urged that citizenship and religious liberty be granted to those who came to New York's shores. So that was what he was going to try and do as governor of the state of New York. At this time, New York City's public schools were run by Protestants and used Protestant textbooks, including the King James Bible. Seward believed that that was wrong. He believed that the current barrier was a system, was a barrier to the literacy of immigrant children who might not be Protestants, who might not be able to read the King James Bible or hadn't grown up with it. So he proposed legislation to change that. Education, he stated, banishes the distinctions old as time of rich and poor, master and slave. It banishes ignorance and lays axe to the root of crime. So this is in the 1830s. And it's so, what these people are talking about is so relevant even today that things haven't changed a great deal. Stewart's stance was very popular among immigrants, but he was disliked by nativists, and those are the people who were anti-immigration. They will actually form a political party during this time period, the Know-Nothings, because they were so violently anti-immigrant that if a person would say, well, do you belong to that party? And they'd say, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know anything about that. And they would deny that they were even a member. They met in secret, and no one was to know that you were a member of this party. They eventually changed their name to the American Party to make it more palatable to a wider audience. But they were very opposed to Seward and his stand on immigration. Again, historians feel that was another impediment to his nomination in 1860, was this strong stance on immigration. Because by 1860, we've had this large influx of Irish and then of Catholic Germans. So now we have this huge influx of Catholics into the country. And that was one thing that hurt Seward a great deal in his consideration at the 1860 Republican Convention. In 1839, there was a ship that sailed from Norfolk, Virginia to New York City. And it was discovered to have an escaped slave on board. The slave was then returned to his owner because of the fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. But Virginia demanded that 3 free black sailors be given to them in compensation, whom they would then make slaves. And Seward said, absolutely not. We are not going to give you free men that you are then going to enslave. So he is a lawyer as well. So he took a very strong stance on this issue, and he got the New York legislature to pass 2 acts in 1840. One law gave fugitive slaves the right to a jury trial. That is taken away in the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Slaves are not allowed to have a trial if a slave catcher catches them. But in New York, prior to that, they said they could be represented in court. And the other piece of legislation they passed was the state would recover free blacks who were kidnapped into slavery. So that would be, again, a major issue of the Fugitive Slave Act. They would just go and kidnap free blacks in the North and sell them south. So this legislation in New York said, we will help to, we will represent them in court. We will give them their day in court. So you can see early on this very strong anti-slavery sentiment that he has, and he puts his words into actions as governor of the state of New York. He also signed into legislation a law called the 9-month law. That allowed slaveholders to bring their slaves into the state of New York for 9 months. After that, they were free. Well, they could be there for 8 months and 29 days, and then you would take them back south, but then as soon as that time period was up, you could bring them back again. So if you had property in New York State, you could use your slaves to farm it. That was true in Illinois. In Illinois, it was the 364-day rule. You could bring your slaves from Kentucky. They could work your land in Illinois. On the 365th day, you took them back to Kentucky, and on the first day of the year, you brought them back again. So slavery certainly existed in Illinois as a result of this type of legislation. But he had that repealed in the state of New York. So after that legislation was passed, any slave who came into New York was immediately free. There wasn't even a 9-month waiting period. They would be immediately free. He also signed legislation to establish public education for all children in the state of New York, but leaving it up to local jurisdiction as to how they would support that education. He was elected to a second term as governor, and after that term was up, he would serve almost another 30 years in public life in various capacities. And so, as I said, he becomes a senator from New York in 1849. So now he's on the national stage politically, not just at the local or at the state level. In 1844, he became a member of the Liberty Party. So now this is the third political party that he has belonged to. Because he could not support the Whig candidate for president, Henry Clay of Kentucky. He could not support a slave owner for the candidacy. Clay was defeated by the Democrat James K. Polk. But the major event of Polk's administration was the Mexican-American War. Seward did not support this, as neither did Abraham Lincoln. So he was very adamant in his rejection of this war that was just perpetuated to take land away from another country so that we could extend the borders of the United States from sea to shining sea. So in 1846, He became the center of another controversy back home in Auburn because he defended a man by the name of William Freeman, who was a mentally ill black man accused of murder. He was convicted, even though officials were convinced of his insanity. So Seward was the first lawyer in the country to plead the insanity defense. But it wasn't enough. They found him guilty, and they hung him. But Seward argued in his closing arguments, "He is still your brother and mine, in form and color, accepted and approved by his father and yours and mine, and bears equally with us the proudest inheritance of our race, the image of our Maker. Hold him then to be a man." So the trial boosted Seward's image across the North as a result of this case. He gained further publicity when he tried a case with Salmon Chase. So the two of them actually worked together before they were members of the cabinet. Chase was handling an appeal now in the United States Supreme Court for a man called John Van Zandt. He was an anti-slavery advocate who was sued by a slave owner for assisting the slave in escaping on the Underground Railroad. Chase was very impressed with Seward and asked him to join the defense team. He wrote of Seward, "He was one of the very first public men in our country. Who but himself would have done what he did for the poor wretch Freeman," the other case that he had tried. So at this point in our history, state legislatures chose their U.S. senators. They would not be elected until the 20th century by the people. They were chosen by the state legislature. So in 1849, the New York legislature chose Seward to be the senator. He would be in that position until he became Secretary of State in 1861. During the regular session of Congress in 1849, it was slavery that dominated the agenda, because this is when they are discussing what would become the Compromise of 1850. Senator Clay advanced a series of resolutions that would eventually become the Compromise of 1850, along with Stephen Douglas. Seward opposed the pro-slavery elements of the Compromise, and in a speech on the floor in March of 1850, invoked what he called a higher law than the Constitution. There had to be a higher law, and that was the moral law that he was referring to. The speech was widely reprinted throughout the United States, and he became the leading anti-slavery advocate in the Senate as a result. As I said, his wife Frances was deeply committed to the abolitionist movement, and their house was a stop along the Underground Railroad, for which she could have been fined and imprisoned. And they didn't keep a secret of it, because in 1851, she wrote to her husband, "Two fugitives have gone to Canada. One of them our acquaintance, John." Another time she wrote to Seward and said, "A man by the name of William Johnson will apply to you for assistance to purchase the freedom of his daughter. You will see to it that you give him what he needs in a book." In other words, give him the amount of money it's going to take to free his daughter. "I told him I thought you would give him even more than he asked for." So she wasn't shy about putting her thoughts in writing. In January, this would be the legislation that would finally unite the anti-slavery forces in the United States. Stephen Douglas introduced legislation in Congress called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This would permit territories to choose whether they join the Union as free or slave states. If Thomas Jefferson would only have written in the Louisiana Purchase what he did when he wrote the legislation for the Northwest Territory, that slavery could not exist north of the Ohio River, that extension west, this would never have become an issue. But Jefferson didn't do that when we bought the Louisiana Territory from France. So now there's no clear-cut guideline. Missouri had come in as a slave state, and they technically are above that line, if you take the Ohio River as a boundary. So Seward was determined to defeat what he called the infamous bill, and he worked to ensure that the final version would be unpalatable to enough senators that they would never pass it. But he failed, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. And for Northerners, it was now the standard around which they would all rally as a result. Those in the South defended the new law, arguing that they should have an equal stake through slavery in the territories for their participation in the federal government. So, as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a new political party came into being, and that was the Republican Party. And it was formed in opposition to this idea of extending slavery into the territories. It was a very attractive stance to William Seward, and he left the Whig Party, and he joined the Republican Party. Seward was, at that time, the most prominent figure to become a Republican in the United States. At this point, Lincoln is still a Whig, and would eventually become a Republican. But for Seward, this was probably the answer that he had always been looking for his whole life politically, a party that most closely represented his own philosophy. When Seward's name was mentioned at the Republican National Convention, a huge ovation broke out in 1856. But they chose instead John Fremont as the candidate because he had more of a national military presence. He was the one who had brought California into the Union, illegally, but he was sent out there by Polk, and they basically invaded Mexican territory, and he declared the Bear Flag Republic, and eventually it would become the state of California. So he was a national hero as a result of that. In a speech made in March before the Senate, Seward delighted Republicans because this is around the time now of the Dred Scott decision. Again, something that he and Lincoln felt was an abomination. Seward accused Buchanan and Chief Justice Taney of conspiring to gain the results, which they had done because President Buchanan illegally contacted a Supreme Court justice from Pennsylvania and expressed his wishes how he thought he should vote in the case. And that was the deciding vote against Dred Scott. Taney later told a friend that if Seward had been elected in 1860, he would not have administered the oath of office to him. That's how strong his feeling was against him. Seward predicted that slavery was doomed. He said, "The interest of the white races demands the ultimate emancipation of all men, whether that consummation shall be allowed to take effect with needful and wise precautions against sudden change and disaster, or to be hurried on by violence. In all that remains for you to decide which path we take." So with an eye to the presidential bid in 1860, Seward tried to appear a statesman that could be trusted by both North and South, even though he had said many inflammatory things about the South. But Seward did not believe that the federal government could mandate emancipation, but that it would have to develop by the actions of the slave states. They would have to abolish slavery. And again, like Lyman Beecher, they would have to persuade them to change their hearts to abolish their economic system. In the 1858 midterm elections, Seward gave a speech in Rochester. He said, "The United States had two antagonistic systems that are continually coming into closer contact and collision. It is an irrepressible conflict between opposing and enduring forces. It means that the United States must and will, sooner or later, become entirely either a slaveholding nation or a free labor nation." We must either be one or the other. Almost the same exact words of Abraham Lincoln. So you can see how these two men were thinking on parallel lines as they're giving these speeches during this time period. And he thought that only what he called an irrepressible conflict could end slavery in the country. So unfortunately, right before the Republican National Convention was when John Brown raided Harper's Ferry. And many people in the country felt that Brown was in cahoots with Seward, which was as far from the truth as possible. But again, that got out in the press, and that was another nail in the coffin for Seward at the convention. He was too radical, he was too violent to become the Republican nominee. So at the convention, on the first ballot, Seward got 173 votes, but you needed 233 for the nomination. Lincoln only got 102, so he almost won on the first ballot. The second ballot, Seward got 184, still not enough. By the third ballot, Lincoln got the 233 necessary to be the nominee. So Seward was so close, and he was the leading politician in the United States, probably the best known politician, and especially among the Republicans, and he twice failed to get the nomination for president of the United States. But he was a good soldier. He campaigned for Lincoln in the Midwest. He even came to the Midwest and toured for Lincoln. He spent 5 weeks in September and October campaigning. He attracted huge crowds of people to him. He went by rail and boat as far north as St. Paul, Minnesota. He even came into the border state of Missouri and spoke in St. Louis. But St. Louis was a very strong Republican place. It was the only county in Missouri that Lincoln carried, was Missouri. Was St. Louis. The rest of the state went to the other three pro-slavery candidates. And that was because of the large number of Germans who lived in St. Louis, who were very much anti-slavery. So he came and made a speech there, and he even went to the Kansas Territory and spoke. So soon after his return from the Midwest tour, he embarked on another one, speaking to large crowds in New York State. So he campaigned vigorously for Lincoln. At this point in history, it was traditional for the leading figure of the winning party to become the Secretary of State, and that was William Seward. He was the leader of the Republican Party at this time. And the Secretary of State was considered the most senior cabinet post. The stepping stone to become president. During our early years of our history, it wasn't the vice president who ever became president. It was always the Secretary of State. Jefferson's Secretary of State was Madison. Madison's Secretary of State was Monroe. Monroe's Secretary of State was John Quincy Adams. That was the traditional pattern. So Seward was next in line to become president after Lincoln. But he was still a senator at this point, from the point that Lincoln was elected until he was inaugurated. So he was in the Senate during this interim period before the inauguration. And at that point, he was still trying to come up with some kind of compromise to keep more southern states from seceding. As soon as Lincoln's victory was announced, South Carolina seceded in December, and 6 other southern states seceded before his inauguration. So Seward was still working very hard in the Senate to try and keep more states from seceding, especially the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland. But the compromise was never passed that would allow that to happen. So Seward and Lincoln differed over 2 very important issues. The composition of Lincoln's cabinet, and actually his inaugural address. Lincoln had him read every draft that he wrote for his inaugural address, and Seward asked him to make changes in the wording and the tone of the speech. Seward softened it to make it less confrontational toward the South. and Lincoln accepted all of the changes that Seward recommended to him. The differences regarding the cabinet all revolved around Salmon Chase, because in Seward's eyes, even he was too radical to be in the cabinet. But Lincoln wanted all members of the party to be represented, the conservative, the moderate, and the radical elements of the party. And so Seward opposed Chase as well as Gideon Welles and Montgomery Blair. But although he offered his advice, Lincoln went in the other direction and wouldn't give way on any of those points. So in 1861, Seward became Lincoln's Secretary of State. He would also serve in that capacity under Andrew Johnson. So other than being Secretary of State during the Civil War, probably the thing that is most important was his being Secretary of State during Andrew Johnson's administration, because he purchased Alaska from Russia. And everybody thought this was the biggest fiasco the country had ever undertaken. So we bought that territory because the Tsar needed money for battles that he was going to fight. And it turned out that the gold rush in Alaska was even bigger than the one in California. So Seward's folly wasn't so funny after all of that gold started pouring into the country. And now we have black gold that comes from Alaska. So his biographer wrote of him, his foreign policy built the future. He wished to prepare America for the great era which lay ahead. So that would be his legacy after the Civil War and after Lincoln's cabinet experience was over. The next cabinet member was this is so hard to say, Salmon Portland Chase. And his biographer said of him, he was the second man in importance and ability to be put into the cabinet. And Mr. Chase of Ohio was that man. So he felt he was second in importance to Seward. Of course, he would become the Secretary of the Treasury, which is a very important position when you're trying to finance a war and you have no money. So he came up with very creative ways to finance the war. He was born in 1808 in New Hampshire. So now we have somebody from upstate New York, somebody from New Hampshire, both of Yankee stock. Upstate New York was just the New Englanders who moved a little farther west into New York State. But his father died when he was 9 years old. His mother was left to raise 10 children with no resources. Because you have to remember, at this point, there's no life insurance, there's no savings account. When your husband dies, you have nothing. And you have 10 children that you have to raise. So they moved to Ohio, and Chase went to live with his uncle, who was Bishop Philander Chase, the leading figure in the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States at this point. So Bishop Chase would be a tremendous influence on young Salmon's life as a result. He went to what was called Cincinnati College at that time, and then finished at Dartmouth College. He was a member of Phi Beta Kappa, so he and Seward have that in common. He graduated from Dartmouth with distinction in 1826. He then moved to Washington, D.C., where he opened his own school. It was a classical school where he taught the traditional Latin and Greek and history and geography. And then he began studying law under the United States Attorney General at that time. Not just any lawyer, but the Attorney General, who was William Wirt. And he was admitted to the bar in 1829. As soon as he was admitted to the bar, he moved back to Cincinnati and opened his own law practice. He was the most strident abolitionist in Lincoln's cabinet. Despite the risk to his livelihood, he regularly defended runaway slaves. And Cincinnati was the embarkation point for runaway slaves, because if you could get to the Ohio River, there was a huge underground railroad network operating out of Cincinnati, and they could get you to Canada. So he began defending these runaway slaves. He actually became known as the Attorney General for Fugitive Slaves. That was what people called him. In the Van Zandt case, which I mentioned before, that he tried with Seward, he argued that the constitutionality of the fugitive slave laws before the Supreme Court. So you have to be admitted to try a case before the Supreme Court. He had that level of admission, so he could argue a case at that level. He contended that slavery was local, not national. Therefore, there could be no national law governing slavery, i.e. the Fugitive Slave Act, and that it could exist only in state law. That was one of the arguments that they used at the Constitutional Convention of why we had to become a united nation, because if we remained 13 independent countries, slaves could just go from Maryland to New York and be free, or just walk over the line from Maryland to Pennsylvania and be free. There would be no mechanism to get your slaves back. But if we had federal law that legislated that, and that's why it's in the Constitution, then slavery could be preserved in the South. So that's why Chase argues that it should be a local matter, not a national matter. He argued that the federal government was not empowered to create slavery anywhere, and that when a slave leaves the jurisdiction of a state where it's legal, he ceases to be a slave, which is basically the Dred Scott case. He continues to be a man, and he leaves behind the law that made him a slave. Justice Taney said, no, that is not the case. Once a slave, always a slave, no matter where you live. He became part of a group in Cincinnati called the Semicolon Club. I have no idea why they call it that. But Harriet Beecher Stowe and her husband Galvin Stowe were also a member of this organization. And Chase became the leader of the political reformers. He wanted slavery abolished legally. What they called the Garrisonian abolitionists just wanted, again, people to voluntarily give up slavery. Chase wanted it to be legislated, so there could be no argument about whether you're a slave or not. His biographer wrote of him, in politics he was a theorist and a dreamer, and was unbalanced by overmastering ambition. Chase is the most unprincipled man politically that I have ever known. He is selfish beyond any other man, and I know from the bargain he has made in being elected to the Senate, he is ready to make any bargain to promote his self-interest. So he had an overriding ambition to become president of the United States. And in order to do that, he would belong to any political party it would take to get him elected. So he belonged to every political party that existed. He was elected locally in Cincinnati as a Whig. Then he joined the Free Soil Party. And he actually came up with the slogan, free soil, free labor, free men, for the party. He was a great slogan maker. Then for 7 years, he was leader of the Liberty Party in Ohio. And then he became a Democrat. So he hopped around any place that could help him achieve his goals. He was elected to the Senate. Go back there. He was chosen for the Senate in Ohio in 1855, and he became, as well, the first Republican governor of Ohio after the Republican Party was formed. He supported women's rights, public education, and prison reform. That was another major reform movement of this time period, was prison reform. There were several leading reformers who championed that cause. Again, he thought that he would become the presidential nominee of this new party in 56 and 60, neither of which worked out. With the exception of Seward, Chase was the second most prominent Republican in the country and had done more against slavery than any other Republican had ever done. But he opposed a protective tariff, which was one of the Democratic Party principles, favored by most Republicans, so that hurt him in getting the nomination. In 1860, his ambitions were second to none in receiving the Republican nomination, but he was too radical for the party, and they felt that that would lose them too many votes. They needed somebody more moderate than either Seward or Chase, who were just seen as too radical for the position. So at the 1860 convention on the first ballot, he got 49 votes. Lincoln got 102. So Lincoln got more votes than he did on the first ballot. So it was pretty obvious that he was not going to be the nominee for president. So the Republicans again chose him to be their senator in 1860. But 2 days after he took his seat in the Senate, he resigned to become Secretary of the Treasury. So he was just secretary for 2 days that time around. Chase was initially inclined to decline the offer because Lincoln had failed, as he said, to tender me the Treasury Department with the same considerate respect which was manifested to Mr. Seward and Mr. Bates. So he felt that Lincoln should have groveled more and named him to the first cabinet position, not Seward and Bates. He finally accepted the offer in March of 1861. And he would represent the radical Republican element in Lincoln's cabinet. Again, his biographer wrote of him, Chase saw more clearly than any other public man of his time, except Lincoln, the importance, the necessity, and the moral effect of sticking to a consistent principle. He entered public life as an anti-slavery man, and nothing ever drew him aside from what he conceived to be the right of the bondman and the parallel right of the community to be freed from bondage. His story ends by becoming the 6th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a position that he would hold from 64 to 1873. Now, as Secretary of the Treasury, he had instituted the income tax to help pay for the war. As Chief Justice, he said it was unconstitutional. He was always changing parties. He always changed his mind. So only for a brief time period did we have an income tax. It wouldn't come back until the 20th century. The third, I guess you could call him top man in the cabinet, was Edward Bates, the Attorney General. The New York Times actually wrote an article on Edward Bates in February of 1860. This is before the convention, when they are promoting him as the presidential nominee. This is what the article said. Edward Bates was born in Virginia in 1793 on the banks of the James River. His ancestors on the paternal as well as maternal side were Quakers of high respectability who had long been settled in this region. His ancestors on both sides were Quakers. After fighting in the War of 1812, there's a problem there. Quakers don't fight. He only was able to convince his mother to allow him to go off to war if he agreed not to participate in any battles. So Mom, he begged and pleaded. He wanted to be a soldier so bad. So she let him go. He participated in the War of 1812, and after it was over, he moved to Missouri. Edward Bates will have the most unique experience of any member of Lincoln's cabinet. In 1814, first of all, he comes from a slave state. His family owned slaves as Quakers. I guess you can adjust your morality to meet your economic necessity, but his parents did own slaves. In 1814, when he moved to Missouri, it had only been a territory in the United States for 10 years. It became a territory in 1804 with the Louisiana Purchase. This was a French city. This was a French-speaking Catholic city. There was only one other in the United States, and that was New Orleans. There was no Catholic city in the United States. That was unheard of, east of the Mississippi River. So Bates was literally going to a foreign country, a country where the most leading citizens and politicians were all French, spoke no English. Auguste Chouteau never spoke English. He never learned English. Neither did his stepbrother Pierre Chouteau, who died in 1849, never spoke English. Bates will be a representative at the state convention in Missouri. It is the only state in the country that has a constitution written in English and French. So the Missouri Constitution is written in French because all of the leading politicians were French and they couldn't read English. So Edward Bates was literally had entered a new country. And he brought all of that with him. He had the most probably international viewpoint of any member of Lincoln's cabinet because of these experiences, moving from Virginia to another slave state, Missouri, but this whole very cosmopolitan experience in St. Louis. And then he would also be there when these large waves of Irish immigrants and German immigrants would arrive in St. Louis. St. Louis had the most diverse population of any city in the United States during the antebellum period. And so he, at a very young age, became a citizen of that. He moved to St. Louis because his brother Frederick had moved there earlier, and he was actually secretary of the territory of Missouri. And so after Missouri became a state, he was elected the second governor. His brother was elected the second governor of Missouri. Again, he began reading the law in St. Louis. All of these men are lawyers. That is the one thing that they all have in common. They're all lawyers. So following in that tradition, Bates also becomes a lawyer and studies with a lawyer by the name of Rufus Eaton, and then Bates becomes a delegate to the Constitutional Convention for the territory of Missouri. In 1822, he was elected as a representative to the state legislature. In 24, he was appointed by President Monroe as the U.S. Attorney for the District of Missouri. In 26, he was elected to Congress. So he was on a very steep trajectory in politics in Missouri. In 1830, he was elected to the state Senate. In 1834, he was again chosen as a representative to the state legislature. In the meantime, in all of this, he and his wife had 17 children. So, in 1850, he was appointed as Secretary of War by President Millard Fillmore. But due to his peculiar family life with 17 children, he said that he could not go to Washington, D.C. He could not abandon his family, so he turned down the offer to be Secretary of War. The claims of his family were just too much. His friends then urged him to be a candidate for the U.S. Senate, but again, he said, no, I can't go to Washington, D.C. I have to stay here with my family. In 1852, he was the first choice at the Whig convention to be their vice presidential candidate, but they chose another person. But he was considered for that position. He was called Judge Bates by his friends and colleagues in Missouri. And he was a staunch Henry Clay Whig, just as Abraham Lincoln was. In regards to slavery, He entertained the Quaker principles of his ancestors. It was to be tolerated as what they called a transient institution. It would eventually just go away. He owned slaves in Missouri, as his family had done. But while he owned slaves, he became very interested in a case that was being tried in St. Louis, brought by a slave by the name of Polly Berry, who in 1843 gained her freedom after decades of being held illegally in the free state of Illinois. This is the precursor to Dred Scott. But Polly Berry is freed. Dred Scott was not, in the same courts in Missouri. As the U.S. Attorney, Bates took the following position on citizenship. It is strenuously insisted by some, Chief Justice Taney, that persons of color, though born in this country, are not capable of being citizens of the United States. As far as the Constitution is concerned, that is a naked assumption, for the Constitution contains not one word upon the subject. The exclusion, if it exists, must then rest upon some fundamental fact which, in the reason and nature of things, is so inconsistent with citizenship that the two cannot coexist in the same person. Is mere color such a fact? Let those who assert it prove that it is so. It has never been so understood nor put into practice in the nation for which we derive our language, laws, and institutions, and our very morals and modes of thought. And as far as I know, there is not a single nation in Christendom which does not regard the newfound idea with incredulity, if not disgust. What can there be in the mere color of a man to disqualify him for bearing true and faithful allegiance to his native country and for demanding the protection of that country? And these two, allegiance and protection, constitute the sum duties and rights of a natural-born citizen of the United States. That was the same basic argument that Abraham Lincoln used. They were both violently opposed to the Dred Scott decision. Again, when the Republican Party was formed, Bates was one of the founding members in Missouri. Oh, those were the positions he held in Missouri. And he again felt that he was going to be the Republican nominee in 1860 because he had taken such a strong anti-slavery position, and he was coming from a border state, which made him a very unusual Republican. There were no Republicans from the South, from slave-owning states. Lincoln's name wasn't even on the ballot in one southern state. So Bates brought something very unique to the possible presidential candidates in 1860. Again, because Lincoln was chosen and did go on to win the election, Bates was the first cabinet member appointed from west of the Mississippi River. Bates was important in Lincoln's cabinet because he balanced the radicals. As a Southerner, former slave owner, and resident of a border state. Interestingly, in Bates' own family, his one son served in the U.S. Army and later became the Army Chief of Staff, and his second son, Fleming, fought with the Confederacy under the command of General Sterling Price in Missouri. Bates disagreed with Lincoln on emancipation and the recruitment of blacks into the Union Army, and in 1864 felt that he had to resign his position and went back to Missouri and never participated in politics again. But he was a vocal writer in the St. Louis newspapers, and when Missouri had to rewrite its constitution after the Civil War, he voted against the new constitution that was written in the state. So he worked behind the scenes after he left office. But Missouri was proud of their cabinet member and the city of St. Louis had this statue commissioned that was sculpted in New York City, and it stands in St. Louis today, and he is buried at Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis. So he came home to his second native city after the war was over. Another leading figure in the cabinet, of course, is Edwin Stanton. He was one of the younger members, born in 1814. He was the kid on the block. He was born in Ohio, a Midwesterner. So now we have New England, upstate New York, border state Missouri, and now we have the first state to come out of the Northwest Territories, Ohio, being represented. He was educated at a private school called the Old Academy. When he was 10, he was taught by a Presbyterian minister where he learned Latin, Greek, history, and what they called higher branches of learning. But his father died in 1827 when he was 13 years old. Again, his family was left destitute. To make ends meet, his mother opened a store in the front room of their house. She sold books and stationery and groceries. And young Edwin had to leave school and to be employed by another bookseller in town so that he could bring in an income to the family. But later he was able to attend Kenyon College for 1 year. At college, he formed his political views, and they were more along the Democratic Party lines, not the Whigs or the Republicans or the Free Soilers or the Know-Nothings, but he became a Jeffersonian Democrat. He was repulsed by slavery. He was anti-slavery, but that was the only area in which he diverged from the Democratic platform. He worked for another bookstore, again, to make ends meet, when he began studying the law. Stanton studied law aggressively in preparation for the bar. He was admitted in 1835. That same year, he joined the town's anti-slavery society. He was a prosecutor in Harrison County on the Democratic ticket, and he was a delegate at the Democrats' 1840 National Convention in Baltimore. He was featured prominently in Martin Van Buren's campaign in the 1840 presidential election. In 1850, he was admitted to practice before the Supreme Court, and his legal career then soared. In Pennsylvania, Stanton had become intimately acquainted with a man by the name of Jeremiah Black. He was Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And through his friendship with Jeremiah Black, he would become a member of James Buchanan's cabinet because Black was named the Attorney General, and when he had to resign that position, Stanton was confirmed as James Buchanan's Attorney General. So he was opposing Lincoln during the time period right up to the Republican convention. This is after the Republican convention. So he was not Lincoln's first choice as Secretary of War. Actually, Lincoln's first Secretary of War was Simon Cameron. But Simon Cameron was a business tycoon from Pennsylvania and a U.S. Senator, and he was so corrupt that in 1862, he was forced to leave office for mismanagement, corruption, and abuse of patronage. And Lincoln chose as his successor Stanton to be his second Secretary of War. Under Cameron, the War Department was known as the Lunatic Asylum. That's what they called it in Washington, D.C. The department was barely respected among soldiers and not by any government officials. And its authority was completely disregarded by all the Army generals. So it was the Army generals who insisted that Cameron be removed from office. They were also at odds with Congress as well. So after his confirmation, Stanton immediately set about repairing the relationships between Congress and the War Department. I always think it's so interesting why this cabinet position is called the Secretary of War. That's not what we call it today. But from the very beginning, that's what this position was called, the Secretary of War. The only people we were at war with were Native Americans. And that's who the Secretary of War was supposed to wage war against from the beginning of Washington's cabinet. And that's why it got that name. So Johnson became singularly, once Lincoln had died, Stanton's career ends. He also served as Buchanan's Secretary of War. But it's Stanton who really is the impetus behind the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. He is the reason the impeachment trial happened. Johnson became focused on Stanton's downfall. He had been chosen by the Congress to continue as Secretary of War, not by the president. Congress renewed his position as Secretary of War. Presidents name their cabinets. Congress didn't allow Johnson to do that. So Johnson began to try and think of ways that he could get Stanton out of office. So he appointed his own man, and that's the man standing, that's Johnson on the right, and this man by the name of Lorenzo Thomas. So now Stanton is the chosen person by the Senate as Secretary of War, and Johnson says, no, I'm going to fire you, and I'm going to put my own man in there, this Lorenzo Thomas, who was the Army's adjutant general at this time. On February 21st, Johnson notified Congress that he was dismissing Stanton and appointing Thomas. Stanton refused to concede his post. So now we have two secretaries of war, one appointed by Congress, the other by the president. So that night, on February 21st, Republicans in the Senate pushed through a resolution declaring Stanton's removal as illegal and brought impeachment charges against President Johnson. So this is the basis for the impeachment trial. Johnson was impeached in the House, which means that you then go to trial in the Senate. But the Senate voted along party lines, 126 not to impeach and 47 to impeach him. So he stayed in office. Johnson was not impeached. But this was the basis of the impeachment trial. So the last two members don't have quite as glorious a national presence as some of the other cabinet members, but were definitely had a specific function in the cabinet. Gideon Welles, again, was one of the older members, having been born in 1802. Again, another New Englander coming from Connecticut, another lawyer, a Jacksonian Democrat as well. But he left the Democrats in 1848 to support Van Buren's Free Soil Party. Again, he had very strong anti-slavery views and did campaign for Lincoln, and he represented New England in the cabinet. Montgomery Blair was like Bates. He was a Kentuckian. So he was from a slave-owning state as well. His father was a very prominent Democrat. Montgomery graduated from the U.S. Military Academy, served for 1 year in the Army after Jackson's Seminole Wars, and quit. He then moved to St. Louis, where he also became a lawyer, was the United States District Attorney, and in 1852 moved to Maryland because he wanted to try cases before the Supreme Court. He actually assisted the plaintiff in the Dred Scott case in 1857. So he became a Republican after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, campaigned for Lincoln, and coming from a border state, represented that balance in the cabinet. So all of these men bring with them to the cabinet their backgrounds, their philosophies, their outlook on life, their belief systems, different parts of the country that they represented, North and South, slave and free. The one thing they probably all had in common was they were highly educated men. That was probably one of the most common denominators among all of them. And this drawing was done of the cabinet in 1861, before Stanton is in the cabinet. The man on the left-hand side, upper, that's actually Simon Cameron, the first Secretary of War. He would be replaced by Stanton. But these are the men that would lead the country into war and then into nationhood afterwards. So that's Lincoln's cabinet.
For those that need to leave, we certainly understand you need to get to other places, but we will open up for questions if you want to ask any specific questions.
Two questions, if I may. First question is, in your opinion, would slavery eventually have died on its own?
No.
Second question is, Cameron, wasn't he involved with Davis, the attorney in Bloomington, who was handling a lot of it, made a deal, and then Lincoln said no deal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was always known for corruption. I mean, always behind the scenes, wheeling and dealing. He was.
Deal where he wanted to be responsible for all the patronage in Pennsylvania?
Yes. Yeah. And that was, for a politician, that was the golden egg, patronage jobs. To be able to have a base of supporters because you gave them their job. That's why people like Grover Cleveland will strongly advocate for a civil service in this country to get rid of patronage. And he was successful. He was able to eliminate patronage jobs and move to a civil service at the federal level. So, yes.
So why did Abraham Lincoln pick him? How did you get it so wrong about him?
A lot of it's who you know, and again, because of Judge Davis's connection, and Judge Davis was very close to Lincoln, and they whisper things in your ear. This is somebody who's going to represent my point of view.
Didn't he want somebody from Pennsylvania?
Not necessarily. He already had Ohio, New York, Connecticut, New Hampshire. He had the whole northeastern segment of the country pretty well represented in his cabinet. So he didn't need another mid-Atlantic person necessarily to balance things. Yeah, Suze?
Yes, I noticed that Stanton,
Now, Stanton's not up here.
I'm sorry, Secretary of War.
Oh, well, this Secretary of War is Simon Cameron.
Yeah, but the one that came right after, okay?
Oh, yeah, Stanton, okay.
That was there. He died, he was in 1869. It seemed rather soon. And he was the same age, actually, it seemed like that Lincoln. And I was just wondering how he passed away.
He just became very, very ill. And at that time, there really weren't diagnosed. I mean, he could have had diabetes, he could have had heart problems. You know, doctors weren't any good at really, unless you had consumption, that they were pretty good at diagnosing. But yes, he died at the age of 55, and Lincoln died at 56. So they died very closely in age. But his father died as a young man. It could have been some hereditary heart disease that they all carried. So, yes.
He was asthmatic. He was sick while he was in office frequently.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they would send him on a trip or send him on a boat to
Yeah, just like, did they know that Mary Lincoln was a diabetic? No. They had no words to describe that, so. Yes,
Lincoln's team of rivals, his cabinet, you said they were all well-educated. Did they ever try to lord that over on Lincoln if he, if he was trying to make a point on something?
I don't know that, I don't know that I would use that word. I think Lincoln certainly felt their contempt for him. Because, I mean, these men had all been raised in, for lack of a better term, polite society. You know, they knew how to act in public. And Lincoln was pretty crude. You know, he was pretty uncouth, you know, and they just pretty much found him disgusting. You know, lots of things that he would say, you know, a man would just never say those things in front of other men, you know, and I think contempt is a better word to use in their attitudes toward him. And they all felt that they were better than him. They all knew they were better qualified to be president than he was.
Did they eventually come to respect him and his positions and how he handled things?
Well, they all tried to resign, you know, at some point or the other. Many succeeded in resigning, or he replacing them. So I wouldn't call it a big love fest, you know, in the cabinet room. Probably more that they could eventually control the agenda or act with him like Seward did, that they could work together. Stanton was probably the one who loathed him the most. So it was a spectrum, you know. And I think Edward Bates probably understood him, having come from Missouri, because he met a lot of men like Abraham Lincoln. He knew them. So he was more familiar with sort of the rough and crude frontiersmen of the day. I might have had a different opinion than the New Englanders. Also because these were all very strong religious men, Episcopalians or Congregationalists, but they all came from very strong religious backgrounds. Lincoln did not. Lincoln never belonged to any church, was never a formal member of a church. And I think that probably influenced their attitudes as well. That he just did not come from the same background they came from. And they found it hard to understand. So, but they all had just had one agenda in mind, though, and that was to preserve the Union in any way. That was the binding tie between them. They might have all gone about it different ways, but they got the job done. So, okay, one more. 1861, this is the first year of the cabinet. Okay, up at the top is, I want to make sure I get them all right. I don't want to misname anybody. Okay, up at the top is Wells, Gideon Wells, Secretary of the Navy. Then the next man down is somebody I didn't talk about. His name is Smith. He was Secretary of the Interior, not a prominent member of the cabinet. That's why I didn't talk about him. Then at the bottom is, right is Edward Bates, Attorney General. At the bottom is Montgomery Blair, the Postmaster General. Then going up the next side is Salmon Chase, and then Simon Cameron. And there would be many, Seward and Gideon Wells were the only two people who were with Lincoln the entire 4 years of his presidency. The Secretary of the Treasury in 1864 was a man by the name of William Fessenden. There were two Secretaries of War. Edward Bates resigned in 64, and James Speed became the Attorney General. Montgomery Blair was replaced by William Dennison, and Caleb Smith was replaced by John Usher in 1863. So all the cabinet positions changed except State and Navy during Lincoln's administration.
And James Speed was Joshua Speed, which
His friend, right. Yep. Another person from a border state which would be important. But yeah, Lincoln didn't have a cabinet with him for all 4 years. Didn't have one cabinet. He had many men in and out. Okay, thank you.